the price of oil and the amount of oil being produced in Saudi Arabia in the 60s and then the 70s, there was so much money, and we have a couple of people from Saudi Arabia here and can speak to it, but so much money, country awash in money, that they got to spread some of that money around to the population of Saudi Arabia. But in general, it's a small group of people, descendants of the Saud family and the princes, and there are many thousands of them, that control the country. And the country is controlled really with an iron fist. There is no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of expression, there are no political parties, there is no right to assembly. If you want to criticize the government, you better be prepared to spend a lot of years in prison, or be executed, or go into exile in some other country. And you see people in prison today, like Raif Badawi, a blogger, in prison because of things he wrote on the website. And he got 10 years in prison and sentenced to 1,000 lashes. Now, thanks to the international outcry and to Amnesty International picking him as a political prisoner, and there are lots of them who haven't been picked, they got a lot of publicity to his case, and after flogging him 50 times, because it's supposed to be in segments of 50, after they did the first one, there was such an outcry. They haven't done it yet, but they still are keeping him in prison, and that is just one example. A much worse example is the Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who you might have heard January 2nd, when the Saudi government executed 47 people at once. One of them was a very prominent sheikh representing the minority, because Saudi Arabia is majority Sunni, the minority Shia, and through his non-violent protests was sentenced to death and was executed recently. We heard Donald Trump say, look at what's going on with the Islamic State, and these people are barbarians, and they're cutting people's heads off, and we haven't seen this since medieval days. What are they doing? I want to say to him, Donald Trump, look at Saudi Arabia. They're cutting people's heads off, and they cut 157 people's heads off last year. And they're the ones that are providing the ideological basis for groups like Al-Qaeda and groups like the Islamic State. So don't pretend that this is something absolutely brand new. This is not brand new. This is the closest Arab ally of the United States that doesn't allow any free speech, free expression, free assembly, and does things like beheading people in public places. The issue of women in Saudi Arabia. Yes, let's not forget, we have a lot of things in the United States before women are equal to men in this country. But Saudi Arabia, you have a male guardianship system, and I hope those Saudi women here will talk about it, what it means to have a male guardian that has to okay just about every major decision in your life. And it's everything from where you're going to go to school, if you can travel, who you can marry, who you can't marry. All of this decided by a male, either your father or your older brother or some male guardian. It's the only country in the world where women are not allowed to even drive a car. Until recently, women didn't have the right to vote. Now, voting, I think, is kind of a joke in Saudi Arabia because there's no voting on the national level. You can't elect a leader. You can't elect a legislature. You can't elect anybody that has any power. But because of outside criticism, they started these municipal elections, so election on the local level. And first one was in 2005. The second one, I think, was 2011. And the third one was 2015. In this last one, because of pressure from the international community, they said, oh, okay, we're going to let women vote for the first time. Now, recognize that these municipal councils themselves don't have any legislative power. They can't make a law. They can recommend, and basically what they're recommending are things like trash removal and parks and things that are very, very local kind of things. A third of those people in the councils are not even elected by anybody. They're appointed by the king. So the elections, I think, were for outside consumption, window dressing, to say, things are changing in Saudi Arabia. The position of migrant workers, a lot of Saudi Arabia has been physically built up by workers coming in from outside, from many other countries, from Indonesia, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from the Philippines. Many, and these people are under a system where they're really like indentured servants, because they can only come in through their sponsor. Your sponsor is really in charge of you. Many of these are domestic servants, working under terrible conditions sometimes, and they can't leave if they want to. They can't even leave the country if they want to. They can't even get an exit visa unless their sponsor gives them the right to leave the country. So it's a country that's built on a lot of what would be modern-day slave labor. In fact, they didn't end slavery in Saudi Arabia until 1962. And a country that does not give women their basic rights. And it's a country that has a judicial system that anybody who has studied any kind of law would say that it is a joke. It does not give people any basic rights to defend themselves. So why on earth is this our great ally? So here we have to go back to these issues of oil. Well, it's interesting because for a while, the US was importing a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia, but things have changed. And that's because there's a lot more oil being produced here in the United States, unfortunately, through things like fracking and getting dirty tar sands oil from Canada. But the US is only using about 10% of Saudi oil these days. So we are much less dependent on the Saudis for oil than we have been in the past. The other is the weapons manufacturing. The largest weapons deal ever in the history of the world is between the United States and Saudi Arabia. In this last decade, it's been $97 billion worth of weapons. And it's not just the weapons that we sell to Saudi Arabia, because that is part of has a spiraling effect, because other countries in the region then want those weapons as well. And one that always wanted to be one step ahead of the Saudis in terms of the technology is Israel. So the US then has to guarantee that Israel will get whatever weapon we're selling Saudi Arabia and one grade above that. Well, Saudi Arabia has money, they pay us for those weapons. The Israelis, we're giving them those weapons with our tax dollars. It also causes Iran to be concerned. Iran being a long-time adversary of Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons that the Iran nuclear deal was so difficult to get through in this country was because Saudi Arabia was against it, Israel was against it, and it's one of the best things I would say the Obama administration has done in terms of foreign policy has been to really push to get that Iran nuclear deal through. And the importance of that deal is that the Saudis were worried that when the US starts easing the relationship with Iran, it will mean that the Saudis will lose out in their exclusive relationship that they have had with the United States. So we're at a moment right now where we don't need the Saudi oil, where we want to have a relationship with other countries in the region that might be not in lockstep with the Saudis' policies, and we want to stop the spread of extremism. So what should we do? We have to challenge the US relationship to Saudi Arabia. A couple of ways that we could think about doing that. One is to challenge the weapons sales. Now there you're going up against big companies and a lot of money, and it's really hard to do. But the Saudis are not only using those weapons to repress people internally, but they're using those weapons in neighboring countries to repress democratic uprisings. When the Arab Spring started in 2011, one of the countries that caught the Arab Spring fever was Bahrain, a country that was being ruled by a repressive minority government. The Saudis came in with their tanks and their troops and crushed the uprising in Bahrain. Similar thing happened in the neighboring country of Yemen, where the Saudis have now gotten involved in an internal struggle inside of Yemen. And as of March of last year, Saudi's intervention with a constant bombing campaign has not only killed thousands of people, many of them innocent people, but has created a humanitarian crisis that has affected about 80% of the population. And the United Nations is saying that there are war crimes being committed, and they have to be investigated. These are from the Saudi bombing campaign, but whose weapons are being used? There are weapons. There are weapons from the UK, there are weapons from Sweden, there are weapons from the Western world, but mostly from the United States. Well, there are countries who are challenging this. The Swedish government, the foreign minister stepped up and said, we can't be complicit with these war crimes. We have to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. The European Union is going to be voting on February 25th about whether they should call for cutting off weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. But the number one country that is selling those weapons is the United States. And there is, within our administration and in our Congress, almost nobody that's calling for cutting off weapons sales. Because the weapons manufacturers pay a lot of Congress people, they spread a lot of money around, they have a lot of lobbies, and so does Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has lobbying firms, all kinds of fancy lobbying firms, and they hire people from the Democratic Party, they hire people from the Republican Party, they have former senators who are registered foreign agents to the government of Saudi Arabia. This shows how corrupt our system is, that they have corrupted our Congress people, they have corrupted people who have relationships with our administration. And that's why you barely hear any talk about the need to cut off the weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. There's one person in the Senate right now, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who has stood up and say, why are we selling weapons to a country that's using it to commit war crimes? I don't know if any of you know cluster munitions, but it's a kind of weapon that was outlawed internationally because when these cluster munitions are dropped, many of them stay unexploded on the ground, and somebody can step on them and they kill more civilians than they kill people in the military. So the international community has said these should be outlawed. Well, the US is still selling cluster munitions to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is using them in Yemen. So it's really horrible that we as a people, because our media doesn't talk about these things, we don't learn about this, have not been able to stand up and say, we refuse to see companies based in the United States being complicit in war crimes that are happening overseas. One of the reasons that my organization, Code Pink, has taken this on is because we look around and we don't see this outcry happening. So we are organizing what we're calling a Saudi Summit. It's a coming together March 5th and 6th of people all around the country who care about this issue to say, one, let's learn more from each other about conditions inside Saudi Arabia. What are some of the, who are some of the activists that we could be supporting? And number two is to come up with campaigns of how we can build some more energy in this country by educating people, by motivating them to start calling for a cutoff in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Another thing that we can look at is, I mentioned the lobby that Saudi Arabia has and is trying to whitewash the image of that country. But another thing they do, it's part of what we call checkbook diplomacy, is that they give money to think tanks. They've given a lot of money to the Clinton Foundation. Hillary and Bill have taken millions of dollars from the Saudis. Even very lovely Jimmy Carter, whose Carter Center has all these great programs to empower women and girls. It's taken millions of dollars from a country that does not empower women and girls. Saudi Arabia also gives money to universities, from Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League ones, right here in Washington, D.C. They give money to American University, to Georgetown University, their entire wings that are named after Saudis who've given many millions of dollars. And what this does is really buy silence. They've been very, very smart about how they've spent the money. If you want to look for one interesting silver lining, is that Saudi money is declining at a rapid rate because the price of oil is so low right now. So whereas they once had enough money to be the sugar daddy to all these think tanks and to be spreading Wahhabism through building mosques all over the world and to be paying for people to go to Saudi Arabia to study and then go preach Wahhabism in their own countries, or even the many scholarships that are being that have brought Saudi students here. The money just isn't there for that anymore, and the Saudis are now using money accumulated from the days that the oil prices were high, but they just can't keep doing that. So it is a time when the Saudi government is trying to figure out how to balance the budget, but it also should be a time that we take a moment to stand back and look at what this relationship with Saudi Arabia has wrought in terms of violence around the Middle East and beyond that, in terms of corruption inside Saudi Arabia and inside the United States from this very toxic relationship, and how we might move forward if indeed we're serious about wanting to find solutions to the violence in the Middle East. And I would add to that, find solutions to the crisis that we are in, because if we allow the largest producers in the world, like Saudi Arabia, to keep us on this fossil fuel treadmill, we are just destroying our own planet and our own future. So I think there's several reasons, including just the basic humanitarian one, about why we have to rethink our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I would like to open it up now to a discussion. And especially those of you in the audience who are Saudis, please feel free to disagree with anything I've said or add to it or anything you'd like, but I would love to hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
You started off with a Donald Trump quote of sorts, and I hadn't really fully formed this idea, but it seems to me as though what Donald Trump was saying, this truth, was more of a was mostly an appeal to because I've been listening to Donald Trump all day. Actually, talk, unfortunately. Anyway, it seems to me that it's what he's doing is appealing to his party, and I'm gonna bring this back to Saudi Arabia in a second. He's appealing to his party. As a matter of sort of highlighting their decline, or assuming that they are in some sort of decline, and highlighting reasons why, and framing himself as a solution to this decline. And he's probably right about that. But the ability for a candidate to speak the truth doesn't necessarily mean that anything that they say. Anyway, I'm gonna bring that to what he's doing is a lot like what I scattered thoughts here. I'm sorry. I'm gonna start a parallel line here. Saudi Arabia's relationship with its people, the welfare state, and also you mentioned the beginning of Saudi Arabia between the Wahhabis and the Saudis. There's another name that's fairly conservative that also, like Trump, causes nausea amongst most people, and that's Ayn Rand, who has a concept of the state, even though she has erroneous ideas, not just because she has erroneous ideas doesn't mean all her ideas are erroneous. This one idea that I'm referring to is that of the witch doctor and the basically the strong man, the Hun and the witch doctor, basically, where she has this archetypical idea of what it requires to run a state, and basically it's an ideological basis and muscle. And it seems as though this Saudi Arabia story has followed that formula very closely, particularly from your nice, concise description. So, when it comes to, I just have a lot of thoughts, but yeah, I'm just trying to bring up certain angles of things that you sort of woke up in my head. So the one being, looking at the welfare state question, I was waiting for you to mention it, and how that sort of relates to, well, there's a lot of welfare states in the Middle East, or a couple at least. Anyway, I'm also losing my train. I'm a little bit tired. It's been a very long day. But anyway, just those ideas.
Could you speak to that, Medea, the welfare state that Brad asked?
Yeah, I would love for the Saudis here to speak to that, because on the one hand, yes, with the oil money, the Saudis were able to build up a welfare state, meaning that education was free. I talked about all the problems for women, but what I didn't say is a great accomplishment in Saudi Arabia, which is women's education, and that basically there is pretty much 100% literacy rate for women, and the majority of people in colleges are women as well. But the welfare state, in terms of, it's a very heavy, bureaucratic, not very dynamic state in which the government jobs are, from what I have heard, pretty well paid, but oftentimes not a lot of work. So it's part of wanting to guarantee that people have a certain level of income, although there is significant poverty in Saudi Arabia. And the welfare state is starting to crumble because they don't have the money. So they've just raised the prices of water, electricity, and gasoline, right? And I mentioned that they were going to cut things like the number of scholarships they were giving away. Another thing that they're cutting, which is actually positive, is a lot of the money that they were giving to other countries. Part of that welfare state has been supporting undemocratic governments in the region. So, for example, in Egypt, that had its Arab Spring that turned into a Muslim Brotherhood-led government that turned into a military coup, the Saudis supported the military coup, and they are the biggest backers of that horrendous Egyptian regime right now. So another silver lining might be they won't have as much money. But I wonder, one, how long the low price of oil is going to last, And if it does last for a long time, how many cuts and what kind of cuts the Saudi government will be forced to make, and what impact that will have on the population. What I hear among Saudi friends is kind of a complaining, why are we spending billions of dollars in the fight in Yemen, and the Saudi government is now saying they won't even send troops into fight in Syria when you are cutting things here at home. So people are going to start complaining more and more as those kind of things happen. It's very parallel to the United States, right? With us spending trillions of dollars on wars overseas while we were gutting basic things here in the United States. But anybody want to either, did you want to maybe talk to the Saudi welfare state issue? No? No, I think so.
Somebody, if you remember, so many things you mentioned, Medea, that in my head, bullet points. One of them was the call for congresspersons on February 25th not to support weapons, makers who are going to make an effort to, really sustain the Saudi Arabian government. For those interested in really supporting that cause, could you speak to how we can get behind contacting our congressperson in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House to not have them and to speak out against being supported by weapons manufacturers?
So the February 25th you're referring to is about what's happening in Europe. That's the European Union. We haven't gotten that far. So we are trying to get Chris Murphy to put out a call that others can sign on to. And I think he's going to do that. So when we have that letter or that piece of legislation, then we're going to activate other Congress people to join. So Marwa's going to give you the information about the Saudi summit, because we're hoping by then there will be a piece of legislation people can get behind. And we'll also pass around the sign-up sheet, because as soon as we have that vehicle, we will send it out to people and let folks know. The other, we didn't talk about campaigns that already exist, for example, around political prisoners. I mentioned some of the people who are in prison, and I mentioned the sheikh, but his nephew, who was arrested when he was 17 years old, another young man arrested at 17 and another arrested at 15. They are all on Saudi's death row, have been sentenced to not only beheading, but also crucifixion, which is a particularly disgusting thing that the Saudi government does, which is first beheading and then putting the body up on a pole and the head next to it. And this is done oftentimes in public places. So these 3 young men arrested as juveniles, we want to help save their lives. And their relative, who is the son of the sheikh, is going to be at this Saudi summit that we have on the 5th. I think this is the first time that he is really publicly speaking out. And we have a couple of other folks. And I want to say how much the Saudi embassy and government intimidates its own people, even here in the United States. So it's very hard for anybody who wants to go back home in Saudi Arabia to speak out, be critical, join something like Amnesty International, support human rights activists. The government is really very thuggish in the way that it will confront people and threaten them, which makes it very hard for us to have counterparts here that we can work with. People inside Saudi Arabia that would be our counterparts are pretty much in prison. And if they're not in prison, they know that if they speak out, they will be.
So, well, I have a question and a, oh,
I'll turn it off.
I have a question and a sort of, a couple questions. Yeah. So the first one is, now that, Saudi money is starting to become more scarce, and it's going to be able to make less donations to other nations or organizations, foundations, universities. Do you believe with that sort of wiggle room, there'll be a sort of space to be able to sort of speak out more and effectively against the Saudi government? And how could people go about doing that? And the second part is, do you worry if, because you mentioned that they are very thuggish, they resort a lot to violence and intimidation, that when they start to sort of see that their powers of capital persuasion start to become limited, that they'll start to rely more on force, and thus, that constitutes a big problem for the political prisoners and the citizens themselves, because then they'll be forced to use violence more to sort of keep things in line.
Go the second way, unfortunately, because when governments feel, and throughout the history of the Saudi government, when it has felt threatened at all, it has really cracked down. And if you look back into the late 70s, when there were several threats that the Saudi regime felt, one was the revolution in Iran, and this was seen by some inside Saudi Arabia, particularly the Shia community, as an inspiration to do something about their own rulers. And there was a takeover of the great mosque in Saudi Arabia by people who were very conservative and were complaining about the corruption within the Saudi rulers. The government cracked down, and it has been a carrot and stick approach. That's how you get the welfare state, is okay, we're going to keep people relatively happy by spreading some of this money around, but on the other hand, we're also going to use the fist, and we're going to make sure that protests are illegal, that anybody who does dare to speak out will be dealt with harshly. So I think if you look at the history, it's unfortunately an indication that when they don't have the money to spread around, they will probably resort more to the stick approach. The other thing is that Saudi Arabia in the past has really relied on the United States to do its dirty work in the region, has not used its own military as when it's felt threatened, but has relied on the US. And now, under Obama, the Saudi government feels like Obama is weak. He hasn't wanted to use the US military as much as Bush has, and that you can't rely on the United States. And so the Saudis have taken the step, like going into the neighboring countries of Bahrain and Yemen, have taken this very amazing step now of saying we're even willing to put troops into Syria. This didn't happen in the past. So I think it's a bad example of the Saudis being more willing to use their own military might, and it sends a very, very terrorizing kind of message to its own people.
As far as, so you're saying that the government is pretty much working on Saudi and these countries, and they're benefiting from us, so they're our allies, we have a relationship with them. Then what do you say to them sending, like, why are they sending, or people coming here to terrorize us? Is that them trying to get our attention, the people trying to get our attention saying, hey, your government is wrong, or is that, like, what do you think that is?
Well, it's a very complicated thing because, first of all, we haven't been paying off the Saudis because they have money, and they have been using a lot of their money to buy our weapons. But they've also been using a lot of their money to invest in the United States. So there is a big mixing of money, and the US economy has a lot of Saudi money in it. For example, the richest man in Saudi Arabia, who sued Fortune magazine because Fortune magazine said he only had $20 billion. And he said, "What? I have $30 billion. How could you say that?" He made most of his money in the stock market in the United States and investing in Citicorp. So that is another way that we are intertwined. In terms of wanting to harm us here, there are some people who think that the Saudi government was involved in the 9/11 attacks. I don't personally. I think there are Saudi citizens, and certainly Osama bin Laden and 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. But there are individuals, and the extremist ideology of Wahhabism really teaches hate and teaches hatred towards the West. So, you spread that around enough, and you're going to have individuals who are going to want to attack Paris and are going to want to attack in San Bernardino and do those kinds of things. But there's one thing I want to bring up that is an antagonism to people in the Arab world. There's two things. One is one of the things Osama bin Laden said he hated about the United States was having US troops based in Saudi Arabia, in the Holy Lands. And at one time, there were thousands of US troops that were based there. And many of the conservative religious people in Saudi Arabia thought of that as haram, thought of that as a sin, that you shouldn't have these Westerners based in your country in areas that are considered holy. And so I would say that was an antagonism to people in the Middle East. And there are now US bases and US troops all over the Middle East. So, if we were rational at the way we looked at these things and said, what could we do to lessen the things that might cause people to hate us, one of the things would be to look at all those military bases and say, we wouldn't allow any other country to have bases here. We wouldn't allow any foreign troops to be based in our country. Why should we be doing it in other countries? And I think closing down the US bases all over the Middle East would actually be a very positive thing to have us be less of an antagonistic policy in that respect. So I don't know if I've answered where you were going, but there's just some thoughts related to what you brought up.
Okay, this is I just have a question about. Okay, so you were talking about the fact that the United States is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and Israel, who are not necessarily friends, and also to Iran, and this sort of as this third wheel. And you sort of mentioned Saudi Arabia and Israel as clients, so to speak, of the United States. What are your thoughts on the juggling act between these different ideologies? How do we resolve that? Do we have to resolve that? Are we just stoking a game? What do you think about that? Just what are your thoughts on it?
Well, it's so interesting what's happening right now, because if you look at the Saudi government, which is a theocratic government, it's a government that I talked about no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, everything, but you have no freedom of religion in Saudi Arabia either. It's a Muslim country, it's a Sunni country where the Shia are discriminated against, and anybody who is not Muslim is discriminated against. You cannot have a church, you cannot openly pray. And so you have an ideology that really is saying that this is a religious state. that is now combined with a capitalist economic system. And then you have Israel, which in some ways is similar. And the US has these two allies that until recently hated each other. There's never been diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And yet the way things are evolving now, because they have a common enemy, which is Iran, they have a common ally, which is the United States. Saudi Arabia and Israel are being brought together. And the Saudis in the past have been strong supporters of the Palestinians and major critics of Israel. But as things are evolving now, they are more concerned these days with Iran than they are with Israel. And so even publicly now, they have been in public meetings in the same place. There used to be rumors that there were talks and military intelligence sharing among the Saudis and Israel. And now it's coming out that these are not rumors, these are real. So I think it's really dangerous when you have these two very repressive governments with huge militaries and the ability to inflict tremendous suffering are now working together. And I didn't mention that I talked about military bases, but another thing that if we wanted to think of how we can start easing tensions in the Middle East, it's also, you have to end the conflict in Israel and Palestine. There will never be peace in the Middle East without ending that conflict. And what the US has been doing is basically saying one thing and then giving our tax dollars to Israel to keep its regime going. So anyway, a long answer to say that ideologies are supposedly very different between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, but all three governments are working together.
Thank you. Talked about. He mentioned not only that African leaders have to make sure that they don't replace European colonialism with American dollarism, but they don't replace American dollarism with what he called Zionist dollarism. And this notion of Zionism, when you really look at it, a lot of those who are funded by the big political parties are committed Zionists. People who believe that Jesus is only going to come back to Jerusalem in the second coming when a certain number of Europeans are there and a certain number of Palestinians are out. So this is a very problematic, not only from the Saudi Arabian side of Wahhabism, which encourages that kind of relationship with the U.S., but also on the U.S. end working with Saudi Arabia to, and you mentioned Israel, support the occupation, the U.S. military occupation of Palestine. I'm grateful for an academic space that has been created not only by Malcolm X in critiquing Zionist American dollarism, but the space that was created by academics here like Tony Martin, or the biographer of Marcus Garvey, who fought not only to tell Marcus Garvey's whole story, but who fought to challenge the Zionist narrative in the academy. And we see this in the ways that the U.S. Academy has tried to censor voices that, like Medea's, talk out against the colonization of Palestine by particularly Palestinian professors. One included Steve Saleta, who was fired originally by the University of Illinois for tweeting in favor of his own culture of Palestine, and how, University of Illinois, because of international pressure, the kind that Medea talked about, that got the political prisoner released in Saudi Arabia, that kind of international pressure released Stephen Saleta so that he was given back his tenure by the University of Illinois, Chicago. But this fight is not only within the space of tremendous pressure from the Saudi Arabian government. It is taking place also as a matter of academic freedom in the U.S. Medea mentioned the ways that Saudi Arabia will work against Palestine and how they've been increasingly working against Palestine. We see that also in the leaks from Julian Assange. One of those leaks that inspired the Arab Spring by now Chelsea Manning was revealing the ways that Saudi Arabian leadership was bargaining and treating as bargaining chips and really asking for arms against Palestine. That's what one of the WikiLeaks cables showed, that the monarchy leadership was literally asking for more weapons to use against Iran, to use against Palestine. So what those leaks exposed was, Arab colonialism against each other, how they jockey for power using U.S. arms, and how, again, Malcolm's warning goes unheeded. So I just want to say, just thank you for bringing light to this and for naming names of Saudi Arabians who spoke out despite the pressure that they face, and the importance of lobbying and keeping that strong voice. And I just wanted to say those 3 points.
Great. Well, thank you. I think as we wrap up now, it's good to recognize that empires come and go, that alliances come and go, that we are in a real time of transition with the horrendous suffering that's going on in the Middle East. Think of the people of Syria and how much they are going through. Think of the people of Iraq, these once very beautiful, old, wonderful countries, places that have so much to offer their own people and the rest of the world, and how they're being torn apart, and not only by internal strife, but now what's become proxy wars. Proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, proxy wars between the United States and Russia, and as I said earlier, I think the only ones benefiting from all of this are really the weapons makers. But it's got to be turned around. It's so hard to think of how the solutions are going to come. But in Syria and Iraq now, and with the Islamic State, which is horrendous, 5 years now, terrible, terrible suffering. There's got to be another way. It's not going to be a military way, because that only feeds upon itself. It's going to be political solutions. And I hope that we, as my group Code Pink, are going to be able to build up some kind of momentum around exposing the Saudi relationship, just like in the past few years, there's been a lot of momentum in the United States about exposing how toxic the U.S. relationship with Israel has been. So this is really just the beginning for us of education and creating some momentum to try to change the balance of forces in U.S. foreign policy. But as we go forward, let's keep in mind the ones who are really at the suffering end of all of this, and that is the people inside the Middle East. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This concludes the talk. Special thanks to everybody who came, and make sure you support the Saudi Summit that will take place at the UDC David A. Clark School of Law, Saturday, March 5th and Sunday, March 6th. And keep abreast of what will happen February 25th with, as Medea corrected me, the EU voting on whether to allow continuing weapons from the U.S. to be sent to Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much for your time. Good evening and welcome to those students and faculty who chose to attend this meeting. It is my pleasure to have Medea Benjamin speak on the campus of Howard University on this February 18th, 2016. And this is an important occasion. It is an honor to have activist Medea Benjamin speak here. She has inspired me and has, in her confrontations, and her words have really informed the way I look at activists after her. I'm studying now the life of the first wife of Marcus Garvey, whose name is Amy Ashwood Garvey. And she was asked by Gil Noble in an interview that I read at the Schomburg Center about what her opinion was of Dr. King. You know, this is Amy Ashwood Garvey, who by the time she's doing this interview is in her 70s. And she says, King has brought an enormous and important, she said, confrontation. And I think one of the reasons that Medea Benjamin rings so strong in my head and is a strong inspiration for me is that her life is an example to me of that confrontation that Amy Ashwood Garvey spoke about. So it is my pleasure to host Medea Benjamin this evening to talk about her very important focus that her group is taking on regarding the relationship between the U.S. government and the Saudi Arabian government. And in honor of that, and as well as in honor of Black History Month in the month of February, that was founded, originally known as Negro History Week, founded by Carter G. Woodson, who born and raised in this city, but lived not too far from Howard University, near the Convention Center, what is now the Convention Center, and what is, I believe, 6th Street, where he lived, between, basically across the street from the Convention Center. His legacy of celebrating African American people include looking at Malcolm X. And so Malcolm spoke directly to the nature of the United States government's relationship to Saudi Arabia. Herb Boyd recently edited, along with the youngest daughter of Malcolm X, Ilyasha Shabazz, this book called The Diary of Malcolm X. And when I was in the airport last week, I happened to notice none other than the daughter of Malcolm X, Ilyasha Shabazz, and I had the book in my bag, and I was like, and I was asking people, do you know who that is? They said, no. I asked another woman, do you know who this is? Ilyasha Shabazz. And I went up to her gingerly, I said, excuse me, I have followed your father's career for a long time. I have his diary that you recently edited in my bag. Could you please sign it? And she said yes, and it was absolute honor for her to sign my copy of the book that she edited. But it is so relevant to the message of Medea Benjamin, and it is so relevant to the overarching message that her organization Code Pink is shedding light on, and that is the relationship between the U.S. government and the Saudi Arabian government. There's a very important part of this book, one page that I would like to read, that really speaks to Malcolm X's prophetic words during this Black History Month when we recognize our heroines and our heroes, including Malcolm X. And he talks specifically about the same nature of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The editor, Herb Boyd, in fact said that the words that Malcolm X wrote down were so, controversial that when the African leaders read it, they told him he could not speak it. This was on July 17, 1964, when he visited Egypt and was very sympathetic to the leadership of then Nasser, Gamal Nasser. So I wanted to read the portion that Malcolm did not get to deliver, but the portion that Malcolm did in fact write, if my fingers would allow me to reach that part. But there's an important part, this is an important context, because what Herb Boyd has edited, what Ilyasha Shabazz has edited, is also related to what Manning Marable wrote about Malcolm X in his 2011 biography. And that is that Malcolm had to draw a fine line between critiquing U.S. policy and getting the support of his travel. There was a group that was paying for his travel called the Muslim World League. And Marable writes that Muslim World League was funded by the Saudi Arabian government. So even though he was critiquing Zionist dollarism, Marable said that he had to walk that fine line. He had to be very careful that he did not make too public his critiques of the Muslim World League, because they were funded by a very conservative government that was part of the policies that Malcolm X was speaking out against. So here's a footnote from Herb Boyd's and Ilyasha Shabazz's Diary of Malcolm X. They write, strangely, Malcolm gave only a passing nod to the circulation of his memorandum, and he may have been disappointed that he didn't get a chance to deliver it before the august body. This is the UN Assembly of African Nations. There might have been some solace in the document. There might have been some solace in that the document was among those numbered and widely disseminated, though it was cited as a speech in many publications. Her Boyd and Ilyasha Shabazz write, it was never delivered. And then her Boyd said, even though it was cited as a speech, he never got to deliver the speech. And then her Boyd quotes the part, the most powerful part that really speaks to the U.S.-Saudi relations. He said, "One last word," Malcolm said, "my beloved brothers at this African summit. No one knows the master better than his servant. We have been servants in America for over 300 years. We have a thorough inside knowledge of this man who calls himself Uncle Sam. Therefore, you must heed our warning. Don't escape from European colonialism only to become even more enslaved by deceitful, friendly American dollarism. May Allah's blessing of good health and wisdom be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum, Malcolm X, Chairman of the Organization of Afro-American Unity." And I share that portion as to begin Medea Benjamin's important talk about the ways in which, since the collaboration of very wealthy oil tycoons and the Saudi monarchy, that the Saudi monarchy has in fact since then succumbed to American dollarism, and has not heeded Malcolm's warning, that he has written about, and if you're aware of his speeches, you know that he wrote it, but he was not able to deliver it because of its militance. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn about Malcolm, but more importantly to learn specifically from Medea Benjamin the nature of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the implications that has on, first, austerity in the United States, which includes the closing of public schools and the massive investment in prisons, which is leading to mass incarceration. That relationship also leads to a growth of the school-to-prison pipeline. We have to be more critical and heed Malcolm's words about how American dollarism threatens not only countries and leaders of countries like Saudi Arabia, but also threatens the working people here and restricts opportunities for them because of this kind of development. So before I allow our next speaker to speak, I would like to say a special thank you to Dr. Clarence Lusane for physically being here, but being unable to speak because he is literally under the weather. We had to all insist that he rest instead of staying here, but I want to say thank you, a special thank you to him. Also special thank you to Dean Sandra Crew of the Howard University School of Social Work for allowing us this space. A special thanks to Dr. Walda Katz-Fishman for agreeing to speak here. Special thanks to Rahel Tabebu of the School of Social Work and Ms. Petaway, the administrator in the School of Social Work, for making this event possible. Also to Len Webb for graphic design of this event. And special thanks to Mariam and all the students. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Thank you, Marwan, for agreeing to be part of this talk. And at this time, basically what we want to do is make this accessible to those who are interested in commenting or questioning our speakers, and especially Medea. Thank you very much for donating your time and effort and energy. It is most appreciated. You inspire me, and I pray that you continue to inspire people all around you to make a difference, because you do that for me, and I thank you. And now we will have Dr. Walda Katz-Fishman, and then after students of hers, if they're able and ready, and then last we will hear Medea Benjamin. Thank you.